but really happy to have Mac with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I know you were curious about the highlighter platform in general. What's your first sense of it now?
I like it. I think I guess it's one of those things where I feel like video chat and presentations like this, like at the core, they're all the same. So little details like, not all being the same size video, like the main stage versus like secondary and things like that. It's little details like that that I think make it interesting. Also, I just noticed that the video chat, the videos are live on some of the bubbles and like the audience. That's a really cool detail. I just noticed that. I was like, oh, it smells like animated profile pictures. Like, wait, no, it's
I
just
know.
actually them.
They
That's
feel like
cool.
small gifts. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a cool touch. It's like it's little details like that, right? At the end of the day, it's like I said, video presentation has kind of like become commoditized like this. So little details like that are what set it apart.
Small differences. Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Awesome. Well, I guess as people are filtering in, feel free to get comfortable. Also, just like just so everyone knows, I'll be monitoring the chat as well. So definitely feel free to engage there. I'm not sure if people can share their videos as well. I think it's only for front rows, but feel free to add questions, and I'll be monitoring that as well with Carmine and Mishti. And then basically we can get started very soon.
Sounds good.
Cool. Well, I guess just to get us started, I can just introduce really quickly who I am, and then also introduce what the session is, which is, well, in this case, it's Founders You Should Know, which is our very first one.
Oh, wow, no pressure.
That's, like being the first one, that means you can never go wrong.
That's one
That's how
way
you
to look
can
at
think
it.
about
Yeah,
it.
I don't have any hard acts to follow or anything.
Exactly. But yeah, so just for context, like Founders You Should Know, in general, there's a lot of great people and talented operators that don't always have the opportunity to speak and like share their stories. And so we wanted to give people a space to kind of share your story and have more of an intimate setting with different people. So tried to keep it a smaller audience. And as I mentioned, this is a spinoff, so it's Founders You Should Know. And I'm really excited to go deep into this particular domain of expertise, which is community, which I think is like a very, very hot topic right now and something that we're all very curious about. So I guess like just a little bit more about Renco, Renaissance Collective. Our mission is to help smart generalists build bridges within the tech ecosystem. And we do this by building a world-class community with founders, investors, and other operators in the tech ecosystem. And we love hosting sessions like this. So super grateful to have you join us, Mac, and to give a little bit of an introduction for who Mac is, so you don't have to introduce yourself. Mac is a three-time founder. He's also a serial community builder. At 19, he founded The Chunk, which is a Minecraft gaming network. He's currently the founder and CEO of Commsor, a company dedicated to building tools, resources, and education for community builders. So he spends all his time thinking about community and also building community tools. And when he's not busy building Commsor and other communities, he's most likely to be found drinking tea and hanging out with his cats.
That's what I'm doing right now. No cats around, unfortunately, but I do have the tea.
Awesome. Well, hopefully they are hanging out somewhere nice in the meantime while you're here with us. But just to get us started off and just to have like a quick thing on like this concept called community is like, how did you first think about, or like, how did you first find out about community, or what does that word mean to you as well?
Oh man, that could be the entire hour long talk. It's just answering that question. I've said that I've been building community for 10 years, unintentionally for 5 years, and intentionally for 5 years. So as you mentioned, I when I was 19, I started a business built on top of Minecraft, essentially using Minecraft as a game engine. If you don't know Minecraft, it's a game of like virtual blocks, essentially, like virtual Lego almost. And ended up creating this network of players who come and like gather and play and compete in these games. And it kind of took off into a business, ended up dropping out of college and ran that for almost 4.5 years before selling it. And it was after stepping away from the business, I realized that one, as you wear, 6 million hats as a founder, it was the community building aspect of that business I'd liked the most. And I hadn't really been intentionally thinking about it as community. And I also realized that it was the community that enabled it to be a business. If we'd just been creating content and putting it out there, it would have been a very different business versus intentionally bringing people together around our content. One of my favorite examples of that is we used to have this like we called the hub, which is like you would join this hub world, and from there you could talk to players and then join different games and things like that. And we used to do every 6 months, we would do a survey on what's your favorite game, and this kind of state of the chunk, as we called it, survey. And after the first one, the number one answer for a favorite game was a write-in for the hub world. We're like, oh, that's interesting. People actually enjoyed like coming on the hub world and hanging out and socializing, and the games were just actually like a vessel through which they were able to do that. So that was like, so as I said, after exiting that, I kind of started intentionally exploring community and kind of fell down a multi-year rabbit hole that led me to here. It's a very, very short version of it, but.
Awesome. I guess like a side question, do you still play Minecraft? Is that something you still enjoy?
Not really. Funny enough, I never actually really played Minecraft. I just used it as like, I was always like a big Lego builder. I actually have like little Lego sets sitting on my desk and stuff. Always was that. I was like that kid in high school who was like building Lego sets as like other people were like going out to like parties and drinking. I was like playing with Lego. So like Minecraft to me was more of a creative outlet. And so I was more, it's like I always had Minecraft open because I was like building things in it and whatnot. But yeah, so I never was a big video gamer, which is ironic because I ran a business that was like a video game company for 4.5 years. But for me, it was a creative outlet more than it was a game, really.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's how you first explored, I guess, the concept of community. And now you're building out this whole company that's related to helping startups build community. How did the idea of Commsor first come up?
It was an accident, as I guess many great startups, if I can call Commsor great, where it started as what do we call it? It was like a hackathon, product hunt. If you know, had a no code hackathon, I guess about 2 years ago, where you had about 4 or 5 days to basically build an MVP of a product without writing a single line of code. And I built what was definitely not Commsor in its current form, but kind of a version like 0.00001 of Commsor. Got like 52nd out of 55, entrants in that. Like did not do well at all because it wasn't like a very creative use of no code. But then it made money the first week, and I ended up quitting my job and was like, I don't really know what this thing is yet, but let's figure it out. And that kind of led to here. So it was actually first, it was never intended to be a business. It was a side project. Then it was never intended to be a VC-backed business. I was going to bootstrap it. So it's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like every time I've like told people what Commsor is going to be, it like becomes something bigger 6 months later. So I'm not quite sure how to predict the future at this point.
That's actually kind of amazing, especially like the step almost seems organic of how you get to the next place. Like the fact that you monetize it within the first week. Like how does something like that happen? Is it just like, let me try this and experiment, or like how do you get there?
I think it's that classic thing of like if you're solving a problem that you actually have and you're doing it because you want to solve it versus solving it for the case of making money, that the money making piece can sometimes happen. Like the chunk was never meant to be a business either. I was just having fun building games in Minecraft, and all of a sudden it started making money. So far it feels like every time I've tried to build a business, it hasn't worked. Every time I've just started building things and let it turn into a business organically, it's worked. So I don't know what you want to take from that, but that seems to be how my track record goes. Everything I've tried to intentionally has failed miserably.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And I think I remember like when we were chatting before, you mentioned that one of the comments you've received in the past is that, there are like product founders, there are sales founders, but what someone called you was a maker founder. What's a maker founder? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's a hardcore generalist. I like to say that I'm the Mario of like skill sets where I'm like, I'm okay enough at a lot of things, but not like really good at one thing. I'm good enough at design to design something that I'm happy with, but not good enough to get hired as a designer. I'm good enough at coding to code an MVP, but I would never get hired as an engineer and things like that. And I also just, so like, there's the generalist part of it. And then I like making things, right? Like I
Mm,
didn't set out once again to build Commsor and be like, I'm going to be a CEO and like have people working with me and things like that. I was like, I just like making stuff, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And luckily it's worked enough times that I've been able to basically do it as my full time job.
definitely. I'm curious, yeah, like how do you think about no code tools in that case? Like, has that been helpful for you as you've been building, or you've always figured it out as a maker founder?
Oh, no code's definitely been helpful. I think it's I mean, Commsor wouldn't exist if it weren't for no code tools. I mean, first off, the no code hackathon and things like we prototype things in no code still before it even gets to our engineering team. Our
Mm,
community is pretty much run on, the classic bastardized network of like Zapier's apps and Airtables and Webflows and things like that. The Commsor homepage is on Webflow. So
mm,
there's a lot of no code kind of baked into everything we do. And I think as we've scaled, I mean, we're 20 people now, which is like, I thought we would maybe be like, once again, a bootstrap company with like 2 or 3 people. But it's allowed us to almost keep a little bit of that, you know, 2-person company feeling of like, trying new
yeah,
things out quickly and not having to like go through the bureaucratic process that gets, longer and longer as companies scale. So yeah, I think no code is critical to our success.
yeah. No, I can definitely see like how it's helpful to start a business and also to have that like smaller feeling of like not necessarily bootstrapping, but like hacking like
Yeah.
away at
Like, it's
it.
like
Yeah.
I'll like wake up on a Saturday and be like, I have a weird product idea. Like I'm not sure if it'll work in Commsor yet. We'll like hack it together and then like it works. Cool. Then the engineering team can build a more
Yeah.
polished version and actually make it something our customers can use. That's also one of the benefits of, we dog food our own product. So I can like put together a crappy no code version. It doesn't matter because no customers are going to see it, but we can test with our own community if that, hypothesis works, and then we can commit to building it with engineering effort.
Definitely. No, that makes so much sense. The dog fooding part, especially as you work on community at Commsor. Um, Thinking a little bit more, like I know we had chatted before about community growth or community and startups, and that's what Commsor is focused on. Um, I feel like to me at least, you've coined the term of community market fit or community led growth.
I don't know
Like,
if I
can
should
you
get
tell
full
me?
credit, but
At least to me, you're the person who like first mentioned it to me. Could you tell us more? Like, what does community market fit mean?
I think, I mean, similar to product market fit is, are you building a community that people want? I think
Hmm.
especially from the startup angle, I so often see a company spin up a discourse forum or a Slack or a Discord or some other kind of community channel. They dump a bunch of customers in there and they're like, yeah, we got community. And then 3 months later, it's, why is no one engaging? What's going on? Crickets. There's no one
Hmm.
here, because they haven't thought through this kind of why. Like, why does someone want to be there? It's the classic problem of like, building a product in search of a problem, right? Or building a solution
Hmm.
in search of a problem. A lot of communities fall into that trap of, they haven't figured out the why. Why does someone want to join your community and why do they want to stay? And if you don't have answers to
Hmm.
both of those, you've built a leaky bucket. So that's this idea of like community market fit. And we actually, I've used signs that like, you have like your community starts to have inside jokes and it scales to the point where you actually have to like have stricter regulations, and the
Hmm.
community grows organically. All these little signs that you're building something that people actually care about.
Awesome. Um, that's kind of interesting. Like, kind of the when you know that there's community market fit, there's the inside jokes and the rules. Have you seen any trends for like how like you said why, right? Like why do people join? Are there trends in terms of why people join certain communities?
Oh, I mean, this is where I think people ask, like, define community. It's like, okay, you ask 20 different people, you'll get 20 different answers, right? That's kind of the danger and the beauty of community, is that it is such an open-ended thing, especially from a company perspective compared to, sales or marketing, which is a little more, you can be prescriptive in how you describe how sales works or marketing works or engineering works. And community is, people are always like, why can't you give more specific advice? And it's like, it's kind of hard because my community looks different than your community, which is different than
Mm,
Salesforce's community or Glossier's community or whatever it might be. And so I don't know if there's like a standard answer to most
mm,
questions like that, right? And that's where like a lot of these answers feel very generic, and it's a little bit of, it's a little bit of like community is all about like, you know, human relationships and genuine connections and authenticity. And that's a thing that's very hard to measure. It's very hard to be prescriptive about. It's a thing that a company can't just like throw more money at. I get companies all the time. They're like, okay, community is important. If I hire 6 people instead of 3 people, will our community be twice as big? No, that's not how it works. Right. And it's, I think where a lot of companies struggle is that they're very used to, you know, linear things where it's like you
Yeah.
put $1 in, you get $2 out in a very trackable way. And community is at its core not trackable in that way, or not linear in that way.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a good point, which is like people try to make an equation. If I put 2 inputs in, I get 1 input out or 5 inputs out. Can you do that with community? Like, can you help me do that? And the answer is no, basically.
It's one of those things that just, it has to happen organically, right? Like relationships
Yeah.
and trust take time, and there's no
Mm-hmm.
shortcut to it. And that's where
Mm-hmm.
community building is really hard, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you can't force it. And that's where the companies that do it right have a long-term advantage. And it's one of those things that, like our community, we've been building our community. We started building our community before we started building a product. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
how long we've been working on our community. And people are like, wow, you guys did such a good job. And there's always that classic, like overnight success, 10 years in the making type mentality of like, wow, the community's doing so well right now. Can you just tell me how you did it? And it's like, I don't know, worked my ass off on it for 2.5 years. Like, I don't know what else to really tell you.
Yeah, no, that's definitely fair. And so it sounds like you built Commsor for yourself, for your like
Yeah.
team. Like, how do communities use Commsor right now?
The general idea is that it's this idea that community, people like to say like, oh, I have a Slack community or a discourse community. But in reality, we're building for this vision that community is the entire network around your company, right? You don't have a Slack community. You have a network of people that happens to use Slack as one engagement channel, right? So it's like you have your social media, you have your events, you have your newsletter, you have your Slack, you have your forums, you have your ambassador program, all these different things that build out this network of engagement. And historically, community teams have struggled to answer the question of, okay, like one, how big is your community? And so what? Right? You can go to your, if a community manager goes to their CMO and it's like, we've got 5,000 members in our community, up from 4,000 last quarter, their CMO or their head of sales or their CEO is going to say, okay, so why do I care about that? So the original thing we set out to solve was take all these disconnected channels and tie them together and give people a system of records so they can start to actually measure and understand their community and start to at least attempt to apply numbers to a thing that has been historically unmeasurable. A short version I've used is what HubSpot is to a marketing team or Salesforce is to a sales team. We're trying to build for a community team.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, just like how do you measure that?
Yeah, easier said than done.
Yeah, I'm curious too. Like what's the most successful example of? Actually, Mishti might come up to ask a couple of questions.
Sure. Yeah, lots of good
Oh,
questions.
yeah, just popping in a bunch of questions, but one of them that I'm always curious about is kind of like, who are your people outside from work necessarily? Like, where have you found communities that you've really resonated with, and how do you interact with them now, like on a daily basis, the ones that are closest to you? And also like how it informs your thinking on community and stuff, obviously.
Like there's tons of them. I think when you really sort of look at it as like, you know, community is the backbone of everything we do as people, right? Bound to like local community, your work community. It's like, it's community all the way down, right? Depending on how you look at it. For me, I think besides like the Minecraft stuff, I got super into like the the AFOL community, as they call them, the adult fans of Lego, when I was in high school, and all that. My first, and there's like RuneScape in middle school. Like it's like the classic. I think like at least like folks my age of like gaming is usually a big gateway to understanding and interacting with communities. I've got like you've got like local communities that you hang out with. You've got like friend groups and things like that. So it's I don't know. I don't have like a specific community that jumps to mind to answer that question, I think, unfortunately, because it's kind of just, it's almost like, once again, nebulous in a way.
Yeah. A quick follow-up. I'm curious if you're seeing the ways that people are finding new communities to be a part of evolving over time. Like there's subreddits, there are Discord channels, like finding your people on Twitter, there are all of these like niche-y things that are pretty interesting. And I'm always curious about like how people find different watering holes or gathering points.
I think it's one of those things that it kind of just happens. Like it's a classic, like word of mouth is obviously a huge one, right? Of like, that's also one of those signs of like community market fit is like, if people are telling their friends to join the community, you're probably doing something right. And there's obviously like tools like Discord or Reddit that have built kind of like discovery engines into them. I think it's easier to find communities if they're communities of interest, right? Like if you want to go and find a community for Lego builders, like you go to like Reddit/Lego, like there's tons, like it's very easy to find that because like very purpose built. The harder types of communities to find are probably ones like this, like Renaissance Collective, where it's like, it's a little bit more of a nebulous reason to gather. It's less of like a really direct interest. And those actually tend to be the smaller, tighter knit, harder to discover communities where it's usually powered by word of mouth.
Cool. Thanks.
We actually have like one question that was a little upvoted, but Commsor, the name Commsor, where does that come from? I'm trying to think of like two words that would put it together, but I can't really tell.
So the original thing that we built for that product hunt kind of no code hackathon was it was called Commsor. And the original idea was actually to help connect indie communities with companies through various forms of partnerships and sponsorships. So we were working with like, the Ruby developer meetup in New York to connect them with Microsoft to provide space for their meetups and things like that. And then when we pivoted to kind of what we're building now, we kind of like smushed those two words together. So the SPON of sponsor got cut off and it became Commsor. Funny enough, I actually had an investor ask a few months ago, they're like, oh, so does the SOR stand for system of record, like community system of record? And I was like, oh, yeah, that's what it means. Sure, we'll go with that.
So is that your official story now?
I mean, it's just a word that like it's also a classic, like, is the domain available is always that fun question when you're trying to start a new project. And it's I don't know. I didn't love it initially, but it's kind of grown on me and it's stuck. And it's a good example, I think, of, right, it's like the brand is built by what you do, not by the name.
That's true. Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess like pivoting a little bit, in terms of roles, Jason asked a good question. I actually am not sure. I haven't heard of the first one, but he's asking, do you think some communities are best built by a community architect or a community manager type function? And I was curious if you knew the difference as well between those roles.
I'd actually love to know what Jason means by community architect specifically. I've heard it sometimes referred to as like community builder versus community manager. I also think the community manager title is terribly mislabeled. But that's a whole separate rabbit hole. And there's a lot of different things that are happening in like the community titling and role space right now. But I've heard people say like community builder versus manager, as I said. So if that's what you mean, Jason, I think community builder is a lot more the mentality of like getting something from 0 to 1, which I think is a very different type of skill set versus like community manager is someone who comes in and architects and we're hands off. As a manager, okay, interesting. So yeah, I think there's definitely different types of roles and different types of communities. There's like the classic, like, like the enterprise community manager who comes in and runs like IBM's community forums is very different than the kind of person who comes in and builds a community like Renaissance Collective from 0 to 1 when there isn't like an existing audience backing it, right? And that's where I think you get more of like the architect builder type versus the manager type.
Got it. Jen, I think you had a question, right?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this big shift that we all made in making communities virtual this year, and whether you think that Dunbar's number still holds in virtual communities. We think a lot about this as we think about growing Renaissance Collective.
Definitely. I mean, and you can debate, where Dunbar's numbers like cutoff actually is, depending on types of communities. I think communities definitely have like negative network effects that happen at times as well, where they can actually get too big and things start to fall apart. You see the classic, like, on Reddit, use an example, like, the small niche subreddits are very kind of polite and very focused. The bigger they get and the more like front page they become, the worse they become from a moderation perspective, right? So I think there's a lot of like, we're doing a lot of thinking like with our community right now, which, for example, on our Slack has like 2,600 members now, and then we've got we've got like 5,000 or 6,000 on our newsletter, another like 3,000 or 4,000 on our public forum. So we're doing a lot of work now of like how do we start to build sub communities within that, so folks can start to find like their sub tribe, if you will, within that larger group. So it definitely applies, and there's different communities approach it in different ways. I've seen a classic thing that businesses do is they'll do like the local user group way of segmenting it, where it's like, hey, like we have the MongoDB community in San Francisco versus New York versus London. That's less applicable now that things are virtual, right? There's no reason for it to be, they all kind of get merged back together, but there are definitely ways to find subgroups there. And There's actually a great book, if you haven't read it yet, called Get Together, which talks about community building, not from like a business perspective, but just like a core kind of like psychological community building perspective. And they have this like third stage they call is like passing the torch, which I think is that's where like Dunbar's number comes into play, is like, how do you scale the community so that the community can build community within itself?
Great. Yeah. Thank you. That is when you figure out how to create sub communities within your community. I'd love to hear some best practices around that.
I think it starts to happen organically at a certain scale.
For sure.
Like we've had people in our community step up and be like, hey, like I'm really interested in like community operations. Can I create a sub channel and start to do my own series of events and things like that? So I think it's one of those things where, once again, I think community management and community building in general is a lot of like almost like herding sheep, right? You can't tell people to go from A to B, but you can kind of like, you're trying to like roughly be like, hey, roughly go in this direction. And you have to notice opportunities when like a sheep wants to go this direction and can like, and keep it cohesive yet separate. It's a challenge.
Yeah, I love that though. The go where the energy is and follow what people already organically want to do.
Yeah,
I do that a lot. I think that as a community leader, you sort of enable that, and then you'll see it come up organically. Thanks. I'm going to give other people a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, I think Jay actually has some good questions and would love to have him on stage to ask them. Hey there, Jay.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me. Funny enough, I joined the call today from a community that Angela and I are kind of in together called The Grin. So my question is kind of just more related, going off of the shift to virtual communities. I'm also curious how you've seen the importance of community kind of change over the last year as kind of everyone, let's say, stayed home and maybe wasn't interacting in person as much. Because I know for me personally, that's something that I've been thinking a lot about in relation to my own life.
Yeah, I think it's definitely on all aspects. We've seen like businesses care more about community, investors care more about community, people care more about local community and online community. I think as remote work expands, internal community at companies has become more and more important as well, right? It's like you can't just have like people in the office and like this kind of like culture community thing kind of happens on its own. It has to be much more intentional now, because it's now like, like our team, for example, spans California to Poland with people in like South Africa and England and East Coast and West Coast. So there's this aspect of almost like internal community building that's important. Local community, as people start to move out of New York and San Francisco and local communities start to see a renaissance, those become more and more important. And obviously like a lot of local communities have been hurt badly from like an economic perspective in the last year. So I think it's one of those things where I think we feel it, this like wave of community so strongly in the past year, because it's quite literally affecting every aspect of our lives, right? Whether it's social life, local community, work life, etc. It's literally everywhere in the past 12 months.
Yeah. Jay, I know you had another question too around like, is it important for every company to cultivate their own community? And I'm curious, actually, what do you mean by cultivate? Like,
I think, I guess in some ways it's kind of a setup of a question, because I'm assuming Mac will say, yes, it's important for every company to have it. But I guess kind of along those lines, what I mean is like, should every company maybe care about their community? Or like, in a lot of ways, when you think of most companies, they don't always have a sense of community. You don't really think, hey, does it matter to me if I'm using, I don't know, like Microsoft Word? Does it matter to me like how other people are using Microsoft Word too? That was kind of what I was trying to hint at. I'd
actually say my answer would be like yes and no. I think just like, does every company need an Instagram account? No, depends on your company, right? Does every company need a Facebook account or a Twitter account or a social media strategy? It's like not always true. I think there's a lot of danger of like companies caring about community just because it's like the trend of the day, which is like, there's a lot of, I think in the past year as well, where community sometimes has become a little bit of like, the new blockchain or the new machine learning, where every company's like, oh yeah, we got to invest in machine learning because like that's what people are into now. At the same time, I think there's also this, because community comes in different forms, I think every company, whether they realize it or not, cares about community. It's just whether they're intentional about creating spaces for community, right? Like I'll use like UPS. Does UPS have like a dedicated community space to like bring their like people that like receive UPS packages together? Like, no, they don't care about that, right? But this idea that like good customer service and good relationships and like good customer experience creates a strong sort of community around liking that brand or not. And it's like, it's a different type of community versus like what we're doing, which is like bringing people together in a very intentional way. But so depending on how you're defining community, I would answer that question like, yes, companies should or shouldn't care. It's just different types and different kind of levels of community, if you will.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, and Mac, I actually like the idea that you're talking about in terms of space. Like, I think we've all been talking about, and the question that Jay had asked is around, with everything being remote and online, how do you create the space for community? It's all about like physically creating it on an online environment, and that's kind of like the weird part, right?
I actually think it's not about physical. Like people like it's. Or you're not building a Slack community or a discourse community or a Discord, whatever channel it is. You're building a network of people, like I said, and like Slack happens to be the vessel through which you're doing it. And I think like people always talk about how hard it is to move platforms as a community, but I think if you truly build a strong network of people, they'll move with you wherever you decide to go. I've also used this line that like from a company perspective, you kind of have two types of community. And this kind of goes back to this like UPS example, right? You have like this idea of like community spaces where it's like you create a Slack or a forum or events or things like that. But then you also have this like broader almost idea of like customer experience, which is also community in a different form. And I've used this line, like I use this line on like every sales pitch for Commsor. But like if you and I sit here and have a sales conversation about Commsor and you leave with a really sour taste in your mouth because I was a total asshole on the sales pitch, that was not on a community channel or space. That was not an interaction owned by one of our community managers, but that would negatively impact our community in a different way. It's almost this idea, it's like brand, right? Brand is the logo and the colors and the language your brand uses, but it's also the feeling that someone gets when they think about your brand. So community really actually impacts every aspect of your business, whether it's sales, marketing, et cetera, whether you're building a community that's not tied to a business, whether the community itself is the business. Every interaction with a member or a customer has the potential to benefit or negatively impact your community.
That's a very good point. Kind of like the details or the things you do day to day do bring up to this kind of like thing you can't control that's intangible that you're trying to impact.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Tangible versus intangible community.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm curious, like also like you've built your community that then turned into Commsor and now you're supporting other communities. It sounds like you've always been there. Like we could talk about 0 to 1 products, like we can talk about 0 to 1 communities. What do the early days of like nurturing and cultivating a successful community look like?
I think it's all about being intentional. And it's like I say that word way too often in my day-to-day conversations about community, but I think it's, once again, I think I had that example earlier of like companies open up a Slack, they dump a bunch of people in there and they're like, why are they not engaging? And it's like, because there was no intentionality around like how they dumped people in there or how they brought people in or connected them. So like our community, for example, I think the first 250 members that we brought into our Slack, we hand invited and onboarded every single one. We were like, it was a closed community. We invited them and set a foundation and set a framework. It's like building a product. I've joked that you read like, lean product frameworks or like MVP frameworks for products, replace the word product with community and the word user or customer with member. And all of that methodology applies to community building, right? Where it's like, you're not going to like launch your product and go try and find 10,000 customers because you're going to break your product. You're going to get a bad product in people's hands. You're not going to be able to support them. You find 10 people and then 10 more and then 20 more and then 50 more. So I think early days of community are more about building connections. And I get people all the time who are like, once again, they're like, what platform? It's like, it doesn't matter. Like you could start your community by like having an email newsletter or like an email chain or a WhatsApp group or a text message chain. Like just start connecting people. And if there's a reason for them to keep coming back, it will grow from there.
That's a great like point and about intention. And it reminds me a little bit about, I remember reading about Superhuman in the past and every person was onboarded by the founder at the beginning. Yeah.
Same sort of methodology. And Jen asked what we did to onboard, after 250. And that's, I think one of the pieces I've said is like lead by example in your community. And it's kind of like culture at a company, right? Internal existing culture almost always beats new external culture. If you have 250 members and everyone's like swearing at each other and being assholes and dicks to each other and someone new shows up, they're going to say, okay, this is acceptable in this community. I'm going to be a dick too. Or, ooh, this is not my type of community. I'm out of here. So like that first intentional group actually sets the groundwork and the foundation for you to be able to onboard more. So one of my favorite examples is our Slack has an introductions channel. And every single person that joined, we'd get them to post an introduction. Our whole team would be like, welcome to the community, like throw a million emoji reactions on there. And this idea of like leading by example. Now I don't have to say welcome to any new member. It's just like other members have just seen that that's what you do in our community. So now they just do it. So like the onboarding almost gets like, kind of like shared with the community now.
Yeah. And I mean, it almost feels like community, like just based on our conversation, is like very tied to values or like principles. How do you think that's tied? Like, do you need to have a written one, or is it all leading by example?
I think at a certain scale, it needs to be written so that it can be scaled and automated, and you don't have to like manually tell every single person, what you expect. But I think leading by example, like you can write down as much as you want. You can say, hey, do this as much as you want, but people are going to follow the example of what's happening in the community, not what you're telling them, right? It's like they're going to do what they see, not what they read. And I think the values part is that's like this, it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's like this idea of like shared values, right? Is what bring people together, whether it's shared interest or shared values. And you cannot build a community for everyone. I think it was Greg Eisenberg had a good line around like, if you build a community for everyone, you're building a community for no one, right? And it's like almost this weird, like once again, the negative network effects where sometimes a community of 500 really tight knit people that are there for the right reason is going to be vastly more powerful than 500,000 people who are just kind of casually in a space.
That's a very good point. And it makes me think of like the more niche you are, maybe it's like a smaller group, but like I guess the community market fit is a lot stronger as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. I guess like, could you give me an example of a very successful, I guess, like process or framework you've seen where someone has used to lead like community growth? Like you saw them do it and you're like, I want to say that everyone else should be doing this right now.
No, I have not.
Okay.
One thing, like I said, I think community stuff like that is very hard to be prescriptive. You can't say do this and your community will grow because the communities are all different and what works for one doesn't work for another. I don't have a good answer for that because it is very unique to your own community. And then once again, that's what makes your community is the way your community grows versus the way mine grows is going to be very different. And there might be overlaps, there might be similarities, but I do think community growth I see a lot of them be like these leaky buckets, as I mentioned, right? Where it's like they focus so much on the growth that they actually forget to focus on like the value that existing members are getting. And it's the same thing with products, right? Like the best way to get new customers into your product is word of mouth. You can spend money on Facebook ads or LinkedIn ads, wherever you want. If you haven't built a good product that your current customers like, none of that matters, right? So it's like if you have 200 members who are really happy, they'll invite 20 and those ones will invite 20 more and they'll invite 20 more and it'll build on itself. I think for us, like we've been building this community for about 2 years. I think it was about 6 months to get to about those first 250 members. Another 12 months to get to almost 1,000 members. And then in the last 6 months, we've gone from I think it was like 1,500 total in our network across all our different channels to like 12,000. So it's like it does same thing with products. It hits a point where it kind of scales on its own. And sometimes you have to have that discussion of, do you want your community to scale, right? Like I said, communities, bigger community isn't necessarily a better community.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And I'm curious because you did see some drastic increase in growth. Like, how do you think about new member admittance and cohorts? This is a good question from Nadia. Like, do you try to control it? Like, do you say like every quarter so that everyone has like the same experience and you can get everyone on board at the same time? Do you do rolling? Like, how do you think about that?
We just do them, as people apply to join, we accept them. So we just do rolling. I've seen a lot of people do like cohort based, as Nadia mentioned, work really well. I think that works really well if you have a reason for that cohort to be together. Like On Deck's a great example, right? Like there's a broader On Deck community, but you get in through a single cohort and then you get access to the full community. Like that's a really good example of a cohort based onboarding. I've seen others do it in batches of 10 where they bring 10 people in, they introduce all 10. There's not a reason. Larger cohorts, it can be hard, I think, to do it if there's not that reason for that cohort to exist. Like you can't just artificially be like, we're going to wait till we have 25 people and then we'll let them in. And then, once again, take all my prescriptive advice with a grain of salt because I guarantee someone in the audience now has an example of someone who is doing exactly what I just said I haven't seen work. Because every time I've said I don't think this would work in a community, I've been proven wrong.
Interesting. I guess then, like, to pivot a little bit more, like, back to the role of community manager, which is the role I know of. Like, how does someone become successful at community manager, especially as you've mentioned, like, it's different for each community. Like, so how do you become good at it?
I think a lot of community managers are hardcore generalists, especially from a company perspective. They're still typically underfunded and understaffed community teams. So they kind of are generalists by default. I think it depends on the community, but I think high levels of empathy, being able to understand the members, and once again, because you're building a community for the members, right? Not for sales, not for your company, not for whatever reason. If you can't understand and relate to your members and be empathetic for why they're in your community, you're probably not going to do a great job building community. There's tons of other skills, but once again, it depends on the type of community. There's some communities require you to actually understand the topic of the community. Like if you're going to try and build a community for lawyers, you probably need to have a little bit of a law background to be able to do that. If you're going to build a community for, some super high, deep tech, crazy thing, like you probably need to know that. Like if you're building a community for like, battery tech and Teslas, you probably need to have a background in that. But in general, I think it's more about like, are you a connector? Are you the kind of person that like goes out of your way to connect people and bring people together? Because community building, once again, takes a lot of time, and you have to be willing to put that work in. And it can sometimes be the most thankful and thankless job at the same time. I think, especially at the company perspective, because it's it's sometimes like a second class citizen at companies still, compared to like engineering and sales and marketing and things like that. Large communities. I mean, when I ran like the large like gaming communities, it was like definitely a thankless job. I think anyone who's running a community at a company and is complaining, just go walk 6 months in the shoes of a gaming community manager, and you'll feel like you have the easiest job in the world. So I think it's definitely, it's also a job where it's very hard, I think, for people to create boundaries, especially if it's a job you're doing as your day-to-day job, because you inherently kind of get personally attached to the community. I've spoken to community managers where like their management team sucks. Like they are underpaid, they are abused at work, but they have a personal connection and responsibility and like this guilt to their community members, where they're like, if I leave this job, am I abandoning the community, even if the job itself is bad for me? So it's a very classically like overworked job where, because just because your engineering team is not working on Saturday doesn't mean your community is not engaging or having problems or asking questions or doing things on a Saturday. So it can be a hard job to turn off from.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely feels like it's tied to identity, and that's the harder part to kind of like separate from.
Yeah, I guess I know a lot of community managers that probably should have left their jobs like 6 months ago, but are tied to their community at the hip.
Well, I guess like let's look to the future then, and hopefully the future is more positive. Like, what do you think the role of community looks like in 5 years? Like, also, like, where in the company do you think they would land at? Like, because right now it's like a little bit of its own island.
Yeah, so I think community historically, and I have a bit of a crass way of putting it, but it used to be the bastard child at companies, where it was like sometimes it rolled up to support, sometimes it rolled to marketing, sometimes it rolled up to product. No one really quite knew where it rolled up, and I think it's maturing into its own department right now, kind of like what customer success did 10 years ago, what revenue operations kind of did 3, 4, 5 years ago. But I think it's going to continue to go beyond that, and I think we'll see this merger of almost like community and customer experience. Like I mentioned, this idea of like there's community as in what's like a community space, and there's community in this more tangential way. And I've actually seen companies now where customer experience starts to become the same as community at other companies, where it's this like broader view of community. And I think unlike any other function in a business, community touches and has the potential to touch every other department, right? Community can impact sales and brand and marketing and support and success in a way that no other department can. So I have this pitch for like what a community-led company looks like, where if you think about like product marketing, support, et cetera, all these things as like, bubbles that are in the company, a lot of people are saying that community becomes one of those bubbles in that circle. And I think community actually becomes the central piece that sits in and around all those things at companies, at least that do community the right way.
Interesting. Yeah, if I were also to apply your logic, just now we were talking about like community-led growth and things like that. Like people talk about companies like, oh, this is a product-led company or an engineering-led company. In the future, it could be like, oh, this is a community-led company.
Yeah. I mean, we're like working on the model now. You've seen like the product-led growth model, the sales-led growth model. We're like I'm actually writing a book about how to build a community-led company. So definitely something I'm thinking a lot about.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to like reading some of it once you have, I guess, a draft or like something that you're sharing out with
When I
everyone.
finally get the time, I need to take like a 2 month sabbatical from work and just like finish it. It's like it's all like all the raw pieces are there. It just hasn't been like coalesced into a cohesive, book or story yet.
Oh man, I've heard the winding ups and downs of writing a book. It definitely sounds like Community, which is like it's not linear.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. It's like it started as just like 100 Notion pages, and like we're loosely like collected. And oh man, this is just reminding me of how much work I still have to do.
Okay, I'll pivot. Don't think about it. Don't think about it. But I wanted to ask a little bit more again on this like community manager role, since this like feels like still like something new and like you're at the forefront of it. Like when you interview someone, like how can you tell that they're a good fit for a community role, or like what are the types of questions you might ask?
This is gonna once again not to feel like a cop out, but it's gonna be one of those like I can either talk about this for an hour or not have an answer. It depends. It's a really hard role to interview for, I think, especially if it's like most community managers I speak to today did not intend to become community managers. They did not, you can't get a degree in community management. Very often they're in marketing or support or success, and they kind of fall into community. So it's a very hard role to hire for. And right now there's a kind of a problem in the community market where like companies really care about community. And there's like a relatively small set of people that have been doing community for 5 to 10 years. And they're all like VPs of community, directors of community, heads of community companies. And then you have kind of like this, this whole middle pack, and companies all want like that director level person who's got 10 years of experience, but there's not actually a lot of people with 10 years of like proven professional experience building community. So I think I also think the role community manager is bad because it has the term manager in it, which implies that it's like a community manager role. So we're actually seeing this development now. We're seeing like community operations and community marketing versus like, community builder, and this like kind of specialization of roles, just like marketing, right? Like, or engineering. Like think about how many different types of engineering or marketing roles there are. Communities like community manager, head of community. That's it. And that's starting to actually kind of have those gaps get filled in. I know that wasn't exactly the answer you were looking for, but I'll drop a link here to something because we actually wrote together this like guide to like, is community management right for you, as like what it looks like as a, as a career, which does a better job of answering it than I can in 2 minutes.
Awesome. Yeah, and I've read the link and I found it super helpful as well for anyone exploring the community manager role.
It's also helpful for hiring a community manager to kind of get a sense of like what you should be looking for and things.
That's a very good example. Good point. I wanted to remind everyone we have, 10 more minutes for questions. So definitely like if you have any questions, definitely like share them now. I think Mac is a really good person to ask them in terms of thinking about community. Otherwise I can also continue as well. But I just wanted to make sure that we're answering all of your questions as well. Awesome.
And I guess I'm always happy to shoot the shit about community. This is what I do 24/7. So if anyone wants to chat deeper after this, I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. Appreciate that as well. I guess let's say, actually, like I know for an example, I'm going to talk about Carmine because like he's actually helping me out with this event. Is interested in community because he's interested in getting people interested in the outdoors and wants more people to get exposed to it. Like, how do you think, like, let's say we're building a community from scratch from that? Like, what are the first things that you think Carmine should do at this point? Like, and that's like his mission.
Oh man. How early is Carmine in this example, right? Of building community? Like Carmine, absolutely at 0. This is once again, it's like it's really okay. Pre-day one. I would start with this simple thing of once again identifying the why, right? Why are people going to want to come together? How are you going to bring them together? And find 10 people and do like your equivalent like product user research, right? Talk to them, understand what they want out of a community like this, like almost define like a mission statement. Like, why does this community exist? Why do I want to join it? And what am I going to get out of staying in it for the next 6 months? And that's also one of the things I think that is like a very, very subtle but powerful shift, I think, in community thinking is when you think about social media or audiences, right? Where it's like one to many, I can get value out of subscribing to your newsletter or following you on Twitter or Instagram without actually engaging myself, right? I can passively consume content and find value. Community, if it's usually, and there is content pieces to community, there's like overlaps. It's not, a black and white situation, but I won't get value out of a community unless I participate in it traditionally, right? Otherwise it's more of like an audience or a content stream. So why, like your answer is like, why am I going to participate in the community, and what am I going to give to the community, and what am I going to get out of it for participating? And that's, once again, super, super vague in a way, but it's, if you don't know the answers to those, it's going to be hard to convince someone to be a part of it.
Yeah. And I can see your point then in terms of like measuring the success of a community, right? Because you could see that I have had many more people join because they signed up for, let's say, a newsletter about the outdoors. But how do I know like what they're getting out of it? And to know that, you need to like think about that in advance as well.
I think you can start with audience stuff. Like I said, we started as I don't know if I mentioned this, but we started as a newsletter, our community, before we actually had a Slack space. And there's always like this fun debate in the community world of like community versus audience. Where does one start and the other one stop, and things like that. And I've always said that like a good community strategy takes both into account. It's like, I actually have this like in our community-led model that we're building right now, we actually define there's 4 types of community from like a company or community perspective. There's internal, which is your team. There's member community, which is like the more traditional community where it's like they've come to an intentional space to gather. Then there's audience, and then there's market. And I think, I'll use an example like Figma. All right. Figma has their own internal team. Then they have their ambassador programs and their community spaces that they've built themselves. Then they have their Twitter and their newsletter and the content strategy they put out. But then they also have things like Dribbble and Reddit web design and design Twitter, which are not channels that Figma owns or maintains or controls, but Figma's community and broader market community hangs out there, talks about Figma, talks about other things like that. So it's, yeah, I think it's the idea like there's more than one type of community even within your community, and you should take into account like how you can address all of those.
Yeah.
And most communities I've seen typically start with one or the other. Like they start with community and then go audience, or they start with audience and then go community.
Do you ever think about like how, or is there there probably isn't, based on your feedback, like a golden rule of what percentage of active users you want? Because like I remember. Like I remember seeing a stat like, like for platforms like like Reddit or Facebook, like 1% of the people are creating content for like 99% who are either consuming it or lurking. Like, what do you think is a healthy one, like metric, or is there actually something like that?
Once again, it depends. I think there's always going to be some form of members like I'll give you an example. Like there are members where I was like, wow, they haven't engaged in our Slack in 6 months. Like they're inactive. But then I can look and say, oh, actually they open our newsletter every week and they mention us on Twitter from time to time. They're still a member of our community. It's just in a different way. And that's also one of the things about communities. People engage and get value out of and contribute back to communities in different ways. There is no one size fits all profile for what a successful member looks like. And that's once again where measuring community gets really hard, because for sales, for example, it's like, okay, either they're a customer, a prospect, or neither. Very easy to kind of bucket everyone. Community, it's not the same, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where it's like, I think community is, you can't be fully data driven with community, which is ironic because like Commsor is kind of a data product for community, but we use the line that we're helping people build data augmented communities. Like we'll give you data to help understand things and look at things, but data itself is not going to build a community, right? Like some magic number of 20% engaged versus 25% isn't going to magically make your community better. And it's this idea of, once again, like community from a business perspective, I think is another reason it's gotten so big recently is it's a reaction to how data driven and algorithmic business building has gotten in the past 2 decades, right? It's all about like automations and workflows and data and tracking, and communities about injecting authenticity and humanity and real relationships back in how we do things. And inherently that is not something you can apply a number to. Yeah.
People just want to score, like how well am I doing on this?
And I think
it's very hard to provide it.
We're building a thing in Commsor where we call we're doing benchmarking. Like, hey, okay, we track 300 Slack communities now. We can tell you that, okay, based on other communities with roughly that 500 to 1,000 member size, like this is what we're seeing. And it's not necessarily to tell you that like your community is good or bad, but it's just a data point to know. But it depends. Like I've seen communities that have 20,000 members that are dead and provide no value to any members. And I've seen communities that are 20 members and are the most tight knit community in the world, and they get value every single day. So I think number of members and percent engaged is kind of like the cardinal sin of community management, of like metrics. Cause it doesn't actually tell you anything about the value that community is providing members.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's totally fair. I guess I'll because I think, as you mentioned, it's very specific to the specific community. And I know there are a lot of people on this call that are super interested in community. I will leave it up to them to reach out to you for those specific cases that we had talked about. Like, I know, like, for example, Carmine was focused on camping, and I know, like, Lee, someone else I know, is also focused on community. I guess for our last question, I'll ask Jen to come up and ask her question, and then wrap it up. Jen, do you want to come up?
Hey, sorry. Yeah, my last question was really just part of something you'd mentioned in terms of going from audience to community or community to audience. And I was wondering if you had any color or nuance on which you think is more effective or more difficult to do.
I think it's a little like chicken and egg. Where, like I said, it's not so defined that like one, it's like you have audience and you have community. They are blurred lines. They tend to kind of happen together at the same time. I think that audience to community is often more difficult to do community right, because I've seen this classic case of like you have like these like individual based communities where it's like everyone follows. I can't think of it. A person on Twitter, like, wow, this person always talks about, sales on Twitter. They got 100,000 followers. Now they're launching a community about sales. And it's like, it's a community of personality, right? And if that person leaves, is the community really a community, or are they just there to follow that person? So I've seen people fall into that trap where they like, because they start too heavily with audience, they don't invest properly in doing community. I've said that, I've seen a lot of people like it's a classic, like what like the Twitter philosophy tweet where it's like, there's no real substance in it, but people tweet it anyway. This idea that like, build an audience first and then you can build community. It's always easier if you have an audience, right? And I'd actually say it's the other way around. Like I have an audience because I built a community, not the other way around. Like I think when we started building the community club, I think I had like 16 followers on Twitter. Like I did not have an audience. Nobody knew who I was. Our newsletter, the first issue of our newsletter went out to 8 people, 5 of which were my family. Like I had no audience when we started. And I think it's by bringing people together, it's actually enabled like the community itself to create an audience themselves around the brand, around Commsor, around even like myself to some extent.
Totally agree. I've joined communities that are like started because of podcasts, and they're huge Slack communities. And you're like, wait, why is everyone here? Is it enough of a purpose just because we listen to the same podcast that we should all be talking to each other in a Slack group? And so you see people like doing weird things like self-promoting,
because no one was intentional. It just becomes this wild west of like, and it kills itself very, very quickly. I think community to audience is a harder but healthier way to build it versus audience to community ends up being more. It's like that classic joke of like when you pass 20,000 followers on Twitter, you just start tweeting fortune cookies, right? It's like because like audience becomes more about engagement and it becomes like a fake measurement.
Right.
There's no authenticity to it.
Totally agree. And the nice thing about starting community to audience is that when each member becomes, a leader or becomes a creator, which you hope to see organically happen, there is an audience for them, because you started out with a tight-knit community. So people show up for each other. When the trust and respect is there. So, and
that's the big thing, right? The community is not about you, right? Yeah. It's about, and if it is about you, you're probably doing it wrong. It's really about that broader reason for why. And it's like one of the coolest things with our community is that it's like, I remember when it was like, every time someone would ask a question, I was like, oh, I go and answer it to make sure they feel like, they're getting engaged. And now it's like, I don't answer questions in our community. I mean, I do. That makes it sound really bad, but like, I don't have to, I should say. Like, it's not like a post goes without response. And my favorite thing, someone tweeted me earlier. They were like, wow, like I met this person, like, thanks for like, and like, see, like that's the whole purpose of building a community. Like I didn't do it. I was not the reason that these two people connected, but like the community was the reason. And I just created a space. It's almost like, once again, herding sheep, right? Like I created a space and things happen in it. And I just, you got to kind of like maintain it and, make sure the boundaries stay where they should be.
Yeah, I love it. We're super well aligned on how to build community.
Actually, I wonder like if if the person who created that Slack channel from the podcast had onboarded the first 250 people, I wonder if there would have been a community then.
That classic, they just dump people in there without any. They just expected, like, they expect community just to happen, right?
Yeah.
And I can leave with this thing. I've used this analogy that, building community is like growing an apple tree. You have to find the right place to plant it. You got to plant it. You got to water it. You got to nurture it. You got to make sure a deer doesn't trample it. And it'll take 2 years before it bears fruit. But once it bears fruit, it'll bear fruit for 200 years. And you have to worry more about maintaining it versus like nurturing it and growing it. And I think that's actually like the book. Like I said, the book I'm writing, there's like the entire book is following. Have you ever seen like Ben Franklin's Almanac?
Yeah.
Farmer's Almanac.
It
follows, it's kind of like a nod to that. It follows this idea of like the stages of community building are like growing an apple tree.
Oh.
So
awesome. I can already picture the cover of the book. So, Mac, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. And the way we like to close these rounds, because part of Renaissance Collective is also to turn it to you and see how we as a community can help you, or if there's anything like you would like us to do as well.
Oh man, I always joke when people ask like, how can they help? I'm like, can you create 10 more hours a day? That'd be really great. Honestly, I mean, like this is going to sound semi cop-outy, but my offer before of like being willing to chat community and shoot the shit and help others here build communities, like in a way helps me, because my whole thing is like understanding and learning and figuring out others are building community. So I'm more than happy to do that. And it actually would be helpful to me in a weird way.
Awesome.
It's just, that's like, I used to nerd out only on Legos, and now I nerd out on Lego and community. So
what was it called? YOLO? I forgot. The adults of Lego.
AFOL. AFOL. Adult fans of Lego is what,
it's amazing.
Apparently we are now called. So calling me an adult might be insulting to adults, but
but thank you so much for joining. And I feel like definitely, I hope everyone here takes Mac on his offer. I think like he has an amazing way of thinking about community. And thank you for coming on and spending time with us on Highlighter.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. Highlighter is a really cool platform as well, by the way. So shout out David, I know who's over here building it.
Awesome. Okay.
And Mishti. But yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.
You too.